I spent 10 days visiting South Korea with my partner, my cousin and his wife in October 2017. On my first day in the capital city of Seoul, I had some strong initial impressions. What struck me was the mixture of the old and the new, a clash of styles that at first seemed somewhat jarring. I was surprised to see garish plastic cartoon figures in the courtyard of a Buddhist temple. Inside the temple, it looked like a warehouse, with bags of rice offerings stacked up next to shiny new Buddha statues. Koreans love to dress up in colorful traditional costumes and have their pictures taken in palaces and other historic settings. Admission fees are waived for people wearing traditional costumes, which can be rented by the hour from local stores. Most historic Korean temples and palaces were systematically destroyed during the centuries of warfare. The structures we see today are almost always modern reconstructions. Before long, it seemed that the sites we visited resembled theme parks, with reconstructed palaces and groups of costumed visitors snapping each other's pictures. That's actually not so different from what other countries do at their historic or tourist sites. The challenge was to catch a glimpse of the more authentic Korea, where real people go about their daily lives. This was the first time that my partner Carol and I were traveling together with my cousin Gilson and his wife Emily. She has an impressive professional background in Asian art history, which was very helpful to others in our party who were visiting Korea for the first time. These scary guys at the entrance to the Mikasa Temple complex are supposed to ward off evil spirits. Our visit to the Mikasa Temple included a lotus tea ceremony. Later, we practiced stringing together a bracelet of beads. Surely, a highlight of the day was an extended talk with one of the Buddhist nuns. She spoke excellent English and had even visited the United States. What surprised me was how unusually frank and open she was when answering probing personal questions about the challenging life she had chosen for herself. Mikasa Temple was originally founded in 640. It has subsequently been destroyed and rebuilt numerous times. Although most of the houses of worship we saw on this trip were Buddhist temples, there are actually more Koreans today who are Christian, about 1/3 of the population. About half claim not to follow any particular religion, which just may mean that they follow several at once. There's a long tradition of Taoism and shamanism here. Like people everywhere, though, Koreans work hard to be successful. They also pray for good luck, miracles, or just plain feeling better. The Gongju National Museum displays some of the 3,000 precious objects found in the nearby tomb of King Myeong. The tomb was a great rarity and a major archaeological find when it was accidentally discovered in 1971. It had remained completely untouched by grave robbers for 15 centuries. The outside of the tomb consists of an earthen mound some 65 feet high, while the interior is a rectangular space made of black brick. Not far from the tomb, we came across a lively outdoor theater presentation. The audience was visibly enthralled by the lively costumed actors. The show segued into a dance-along with members of the audience, who enjoyed the chance to stretch out and move to the strains of recorded Korean music. This Hilltop Fortress looks down on the city of Gongju and was once its focal point. The walls were originally built of mud in the 5th century and later upgraded to stone. They still extend for over 1.5 miles, enclosing a large area that once contained the Baekje King's Palace. Baekje was one of 3 kingdoms in Korea. Until they were united in the 7th century, they frequently fought against each other and against their more powerful neighbors, China and Japan. The elaborate changing of the guard show adds to the theme park character of this site, but has no actual basis in historic fact. Korean cuisine, based on rice, fresh vegetables, and meat, is usually delicious. Some meals offer unexpected surprises. Rapid development over the last few decades has fueled a construction boom. Most South Koreans today are apartment dwellers. Many like to live in high-rise apartment blocks that have sprouted up in most cities and in many villages across the country. Children tend to live at home until they marry, so apartments are typically spacious with at least 2 to 3 bedrooms and several balconies. The traditional Hanok village is a popular tourist site in the city of Gyeongju. It has some 800 traditional houses called Hanok, a Korean style dating back to the 14th century and differing by region, climate, and social class.
Because fish always open its eyes like that.
Many Hanok villages disappeared during South Korea's rapid development and modernization. The one in Jeonju is particularly well preserved and contrasts sharply with the surrounding modern city of over 500,000 inhabitants. As is often the case, the popularity of this historic gem has led to a huge increase in the number of visitors, which now exceeds 8 million annually. Hundreds of souvenir stores, hotels, and restaurants have moved in to serve the tens of thousands of daily visitors. This rapid commercialization threatens to turn this quaint old part of town into a money trap overrun by tourists like myself. Jeonju is known for its version of Bibimbap, a Korean dish consisting of rice topped with an assortment of sautéed vegetables, sliced meat, mushrooms, sesame oil, red pepper, and fermented soybean paste. Maizan literally means horse ears. The left mountain peak is called the male ear, while the right one is seen as the female. Maizan Provincial Park, less than an hour's drive from Jeonju, is a popular excursion site for both Koreans and foreigners. We enjoyed milder October weather in South Korea than we are used to at home, but the bright fall foliage can be equally stunning. Walking through the park, we saw a number of vendors selling ginseng and a variety of other traditional foods and spices. The blue and white swan boats on the lake behind the horse ears seemed to be idyllic. Continuing our walk to the base of the female ear, we arrived at the Tapsa Buddhist temple. Tapsa means pagoda, and the sanctuary is surrounded by some scores of stone piles resembling pagodas. They were built a century ago over a 30-year period by Lee Gap-pyong, a retired scholar who later became a monk. The amazing thing is that those stones are not held together by any mortar or other adhesive. Of the 120 impressive pagoda structures that Lee built, 80 still remain, despite often severe weather and strong winds. Fervent religiosity and crass commercialism are never far apart and sometimes almost intertwined. This is a highly developed, densely populated country. About 50 million people live in an area around the size of Indiana. While Buddhism is the traditional religion, there are signs everywhere that Koreans have embraced capitalism as their guiding faith. The Boseong tea plantation is located near the southern tip of the Korean peninsula. Even for someone like me, who's not particularly fond of green tea, this plantation was one of the loveliest sights to visit. Wild tea has been cultivated here since the middle of the 4th century. This particular plantation was established 60 years ago. Today, there are some 6 million tea trees in Boseong, which account for about 40% of the country's tea production. At the end of our visit, we spent some time in the plantation's cafe, where visitors can sample different types of tea and shop for a huge variety of products containing green tea. This old village, located within the Daejeon Fortress, is one of the best preserved of its kind in the country. Although there were moments here when I again felt that I was in some kind of theme park, the fortress walls and many of the buildings here are authentic. So are the 300 people in 90 households who still live here and go about their daily lives. As a foreign tourist, it feels more than a bit weird to be strolling around the village and peeking into these people's households, calmly observing some of these folks going about their daily lives. Villagers derive their income from a mixture of traditional farming and modern tourism. Some families provide homestay and guest house services, enabling visitors to get a closer look at family and village life after most other tourists have left to spend the night in a modern hotel. The village was first established over 1,000 years ago and served as an administrative center during the Joseon dynasty. It is one of the few remaining villages that for some reason was spared and left virtually untouched during the Japanese occupation. Some of the houses have traditional thatched roofs. I watched with a mixture of fascination and awe as men and women engaged in the hard work of preparing the straw for roofing material. The location of this old village, set against a backdrop of rugged mountains, is quite spectacular. This stone staircase struck me as a Korean version of a stairway to heaven. Most of our lunch stops were well researched and carefully planned. Our meals were seldom lavish, but generally included a substantial diversity of Korean side dishes. This beautiful ecological park is located near the city of Suncheon. It is a surprisingly intact coastal wetland whose diverse features include a river mouth, extensive reed fields, salt marshes, mudflats, and several islands. Visitors could stroll atop a 3-mile-long boardwalk through portions of the wetland, with its dense growth of reeds that are more than 6 feet tall. Mud skippers and crabs can be observed in the mudflats beneath the boardwalk. The area provides permanent or temporary habitat for some 140 species of birds. The setting of this wetland reserve adds to its charm, being adjacent to rice paddies, salt farms, seaside villages, and mountains. Seeing all the boats in the harbor bay at sunset left a very strong impression indeed. This hotel in Yeosu was one of the best ones we stayed in during our Korean trip. We boarded a fast tour boat for a beautiful cruise around Odongdo Island in Yeosu. The second Dolsan Bridge links Yeosu with the nearby Dolsan Island. Korea's high level of development was certainly evident during our hour-long cruise of the bay. Odongdo Island is known for its lighthouse, its beautiful wildflowers, and especially its camellias, which bloom throughout the winter. Yeosu had some of the most interesting modern architecture that we saw on this trip to Korea. Wherever we looked, there were new buildings, from modern industrial sites to huge churches. This fortress is a shrine to the patriotic sacrifices of Koreans in their battles against Japanese invaders. Over 400 years ago, a few thousand Koreans defeated a Japanese force 5 times their number. The enemy returned 8 months later with 100,000 men to successfully avenge their previous defeat. Nonge, a 17-year-old local courtesan, was forced to entertain Japanese officers at their victory celebration. While embracing a Japanese general, she jumped into the river below, killing them both. Today, the rock from which she jumped is a national monument. This enormous department store is one of the defining landmarks in Busan, the country's second-largest city. In fact, the Guinness Book of Records lists it as the largest shopping complex in the world. The predecessor company originated over 90 years ago and has since grown into a chain with dozens of stores throughout the country. Its subsidiary is E-Mart, which owns almost 200 stores in South Korea, China, and Vietnam. The flagship Centum City department store consists of 11 floors. In addition to the usual department store items such as clothing, houseware, and electronics, this megastore includes extensive food items, a multiplex cinema, a vehicle maintenance shop, an ice skating rink, a dentist's office, and a dermatology clinic. Busan has Korea's busiest port and 3.5 million inhabitants. Although we didn't get to see much of this sprawling city, it looked stunning at night. The Hyundai Motor Group is a huge multinational conglomerate headquartered in Seoul. It includes Kia cars and is the third largest vehicle manufacturer in the world. After passing a cluster of outlet stores, a trail leads through a forest of pine, cherry trees, and magnolias to Daejeon Park near the city of Ulsan. It includes a lighthouse and weathered rock outcroppings that are continually being battered by Pacific waves. An iron bridge leads to a large rock island that has been likened to a dragon rising out of the sea. The site offers stunning views across the bay to the Hyundai Industrial Complex. The park is a popular excursion site for school kids and others. Because Korean families spend so much on raising and educating their kids, they have one of the lowest birth rates anywhere, an enormous problem for the future. This is part of the output from the Hyundai Motor Group, which sold over 7 million vehicles in 2017. The modern plant and high-rise apartment blocks can be seen in the background. Since most of the country is mountainous or hilly, less than a quarter of Korea's land is cultivated. Rice accounts for 90% of the country's grain production and nearly half of its farm income. Still, rice production continues to fall despite government subsidies. As Korea develops into a high-tech modern society, agricultural workers are leaving their villages and moving from farms to factories and offices. People's tastes are also shifting away from rice and toward more consumption of imported grains and flour. The Bulguksa Temple complex, one of the central sites of Korean Buddhism, contains a variety of different halls, sanctuaries, ornate stone sculptures, and gilt bronze statues of Buddha. There are 2 stone pagodas outside the main hall, which is unusual. Although one is quite simple and the other highly ornate, both apparently date from the 8th century and contain Buddhist relics. Inside the main temple hall are a number of statues. The central one, almost 6 feet tall, is a gilt bronze statue of a seated Buddha dating from the 9th century. He is referred to as the Buddha of Enlightenment, reflecting supreme wisdom. Located on the slopes of Mount Toham in Gyeongju, this temple complex is classified as Historic and Scenic Site Number 1 by the South Korean government. A masterpiece of the golden age of Buddhist art in the Silla Kingdom, the temple originally dates from the middle of the 8th century. It has since been destroyed, rebuilt, and renovated about 50 times. The last major restoration was completed in 1973. Tumuli Park in Gyeongju features over 24 grassy burial mounds. Some were built during the 6th and 7th centuries for the tombs belonging to the kings and queens of the Silla Kingdom. The only tomb in Korea open to visitors is called Heavenly Horse Tomb. It refers to the many horse-related items that were among the 12,000 artifacts found in this tomb when it was excavated 45 years ago. This is the oldest astronomical observatory in Asia and perhaps in the world. Ceramic artists today continue in the traditions established many centuries ago. This museum is close to the royal burial mounds and displays many treasures found there. Of particular interest are the Neolithic Petroglyphs dating back at least 5,000 years. There are some 300 carvings on shale of people and a variety of animals, including deer, turtles, birds, fish, and whales. The museum's treasures include crowns and other jewelry from the Silla Kingdom, as well as a wide assortment of early Korean ceramics and statuary. Gyeongju was the capital of Silla, one of the 3 kingdoms of Korea. The kingdom of Silla was founded in 57 BC and lasted almost 1,000 years. The 3 kingdoms were united in 936 by the northern kingdom of Goryeo. Goryeo is the origin of the modern word Korea. I was continually impressed by the high level of cleanliness found throughout South Korea. Haho is a traditional folk village that was founded during the Joseon dynasty in the 16th century. It has essentially been a one-clan community since that time. Nakdong River flows around the village's perimeter, giving it the shape of a lotus flower or 2 interlocking commas. This layout follows the guidelines of Pungsu, the Korean version of Feng Shui. The village has preserved a large number of tile roof residences and thatched roof servants' homes reflecting the architecture during the Joseon dynasty. The villagers have also preserved some of the ancient customs of that period, such as certain shamanist rites, mask dances, and other celebrations honoring the communal spirits of the village. It felt like we were back in kindergarten as we were instructed on the proper way to fold our colored paper boxes. The Hanji theme park in Wonju is actually a museum with hands-on instructional workshops. Hanji is handmade Korean paper that has long played an important role in its culture and history. It was widely used domestically and also served as a lucrative export item to China. Through an ancient and rather complicated process, Hanji is produced from the inner bark of paper mulberry trees, which are native to Korea. Hanji is not only beautiful, it is also waterproof and durable. The oldest existing Hanji text in Korea is 800 years old. In addition to its use in writing and artwork, it has a number of other applications. When folded to the proper thickness, it was used to make lightweight, arrow-proof armor for Korean soldiers. We got a brief glimpse of the site for the 2018 Winter Olympics in Pyongchang several months before the start of the Games. The ski jumps were huge. The Jumunjin Seafood Market is located right next to the port, which is home to a large fleet of squid boats. This fish market is not as big as the three major ones in Seoul, but it is still the largest one on Korea's east coast. In addition to squid and a huge assortment of dried seafood, the market offers dozens of other kinds of fresh seafood, including mackerel, pollocks, pikes, abalone, cuttlefish, shrimp, clams, oysters, prawns, salmon, octopus, and crabs. For many centuries, seafood has been an essential ingredient in the Korean diet. The average Korean person consumes over 100 pounds of seafood a year, 6 times as much as the average for American consumers. Although the market is open 15 hours a day during the week, most of the business takes place very early in the morning, when trucks from far and wide come in to pick up the daily catch and deliver it to stores and restaurants throughout the region. It was hard to fathom that this enormous amount of fresh fish and dried fish products would all get purchased and eventually consumed. I enjoyed watching some of the mostly female vendors relaxing and socializing over their bowls of seafood during their lunch break. On our walk down Jujeonggol Valley in Seoraksan National Park, we experienced a spectacular display of colorful fall foliage at its peak. The 60-square-mile park is of modest size, but it's a real natural treasure. Towering above the valley is an impressive array of granite mountain peaks, some more than 5,000 feet high. We didn't see any wildlife, but we did see thousands of other park visitors. So many, in fact, that at times we often struggled to move ahead through the huge crowds of people walking in the opposite direction. The park is known for its biodiversity, its habitat to more than 1,000 plant species, and an even greater number of animals, including Asian black bear, Siberian flying squirrel, and Chinese sparrowhawk. During our 10-day trip in Korea, we were continually being reminded how densely populated the country really is. The Koreans we encountered seemed unusually polite and well-mannered. At the end of our walk, we visited a small Buddhist temple, which are not unusual in tranquil spots of great natural beauty. In today's age of mass tourism, the tranquility has largely been obliterated by day trippers like myself. After our week of touring the Korean peninsula, we returned to the capital for a few more days. That couldn't possibly do justice to this sprawling metropolitan area with over 20 million people. We barely scratched the surface by seeing a few highlights, such as a popular nighttime market. This modern megacity's highly efficient transportation system and its negligible crime rate are enviable, but there is almost no diversity among its population of 98% ethnic Koreans. We traveled 30 miles north of Seoul to the North Korean border, one of the most heavily fortified in the world. It's surrounded by a demilitarized buffer zone, the infamous DMZ. Not surprisingly, the DMZ struck me as yet another Korean theme park. This one complete with playgrounds, carnival rides, and lots of memorials to the fallen heroes of the Korean Civil War that ended 65 years ago. Even though the fighting stopped over half a century ago, North and South Korea are technically still at war. They never concluded a peace treaty after their 3-year civil war that ended in an armistice in 1953. The site has more than 1 million visitors a year, many of them young soldiers and aging wartime vets. Tensions were particularly high between the two Koreas when we visited in 2017. A new American President Trump and the young North Korean dictator Kim were very publicly hurling insults at each other and threatening nuclear annihilation. South Koreans were particularly concerned at this time. Many millions of them living in and around Seoul are well within the range of even the conventional North Korean artillery aimed directly at them. This train station is on the rail line connecting the two Koreas. Since 2007, it has been open and closed several times. It symbolizes the hope of eventual reunification. From various observatories, one can look across the DMZ into North Korea, one of the most isolated countries in the world. It's quite undeveloped compared to South Korea. The parallels to formerly divided Germany are obvious, yet the situations are enormously different. Most East Germans regularly watched West German television, and millions were allowed to visit relatives in the West. North Koreans, by contrast, remain at a relatively low level of development and have occasionally suffered devastating famine. Unification is likely to take decades and cost trillions. Back in Seoul, we saw a well-organized strike for higher pay by LG workers. Police protected a tent city that strikers had erected on the sidewalk. Strolling through downtown Seoul, we could see lots of people on the street and a special event taking place in one of the city's main squares. In a popular pedestrian zone near our hotel, there were throngs of people out for dinner or on an evening stroll. I always enjoyed listening to street musicians and watching food workers skillfully prepare their specialties. Of the 5 grand palaces in Seoul, this is the second one we visited and our favorite because of its architecture and extensive gardens. All were built by the kings of the Joseon dynasty, which lasted for 500 years from the end of the 14th to the end of the 19th century. Already on our first day in Korea, we had observed that many women and men here love to dress up in traditional outfits and pose for pictures in historical settings. Today was no exception. Behind the palace complex is the so-called hidden or rear garden, a lovely park used by the royal family and palace women that extends for almost 80 acres. Its main features include a lotus pond, pavilions, landscape lawns, and of course many flowers. 100 different species are represented here among the 26,000 specimen trees, some planted over 3 centuries ago. This area was sometimes referred to as the Forbidden Garden, since even high government and court officials were not allowed to enter here without the king's permission. The garden was used for a variety of social events, such as royal feasts, archery tournaments, and fireworks displays. The stone feature was created in the 17th century. It has a U-shaped channel for floating cups to those sitting downstream. Above the little waterfall is a poem etched into the stone. The original palace was completed in 1412. It has since been totally destroyed and completely rebuilt numerous times. Unlike European palaces, which consist of one enormous stone building with multiple floors and scores of high-ceilinged rooms, Korean palaces are complexes with a large number of different wooden structures and courtyards. There are separate buildings to house the throne hall, the royal bedchambers, banquet halls, meeting halls, offices of government officials, as well as living quarters and work areas for military officers and servants. Of the many buildings that once stood here, only 13 remain on the palace grounds today. Although Korea was annexed by Japan in 1910, Korea's last emperor was allowed to live here until his death in 1926. Other elderly royal family members also spent the rest of their lives here. We thought it would be nice to go to the landmark TV tower for sunset, but thousands of other people had the exact same idea. We didn't expect to be in line for over an hour as we waited for the cable car to take us up to the base of the tower atop Namsam Mountain. We did manage to get a fleeting glimpse of the setting sun from a very crowded cable car. Seoul Tower was built in 1970 and opened to the public 10 years later. Since then, it has become the capital's #1 tourist attraction with over 8 million visitors annually. We were fascinated by a young couple that was truly fascinated by themselves. The subway system impressed us with its high efficiency and its unparalleled cleanliness. Gas masks are readily available in case of an accident or terrorist attack. This subway rider appeared to be making sure that he still had all 5 fingers. My impression is that fewer Koreans read on the subway than those in America, Germany, or Russia. The National Museum of Korea is the country's principal institution devoted to displaying and interpreting artifacts of its long history and distinct culture. The museum was founded after World War II, following Japanese occupation from 1910 to 1945. The grand new building was opened in 2005. It claims to be the largest museum in Asia, with the highest number of visitors. Its collection boasts some 300,000 artifacts, only 5% of which are on display at any one time. A unified Korea first emerged at the end of the 7th century. Since then, Korea has continued to develop its own national identity, rooted in a common language and alphabet that is completely different from either Chinese or Japanese. Despite its strong national identity, Korea has been closely intertwined for centuries with its 2 most influential neighbors, China and Japan. Through many centuries of trade, travels, and warfare, Korea has absorbed an enormous amount of cultural influences from both of these larger Southeast Asian empires. It takes a discerning eye and more than a passing knowledge of art history to be able to distinguish a Korean piece of pottery, bowl, or Buddha from its Chinese or Japanese counterpart, which is precisely what makes this museum so important. Publishers complain that more Koreans should read for leisure or pleasure. Most of the books they buy are educational in nature, geared towards self-improvement, test preparation, educational or professional advancement. One sees advertising just about everywhere in South Korea, on sides of buildings, outdoors, and throughout the subway system below ground. On our last morning, we had just a few hours before boarding our China East Airlines flight to Shanghai and from there back to New York. We experienced so much during our visit, including lots of great Korean food. More memorable was the fact that we saw and learned a lot about Korea's complex, colorful, and often painful history as it sought to preserve its national identity against overpowering neighbors. Even at the airport, as a group of costumed employees went through their promotional paces, it was hard to escape the impression that we were leaving a gigantic commercial theme park. We returned home with many fine memories of a rapidly developing, friendly and dynamic South Korea.